We are gathered here for a common purpose, to remember and honor the loyalty, the bravery, and the sacrifice that took place in these fields and in the woods beyond 199 years ago today. As you look out over this area now, it is, for the most part, a very silent scene. But on the late afternoon of July 5th, 1814, it was alive with the deafening noise and action of battle, a battle in which some 4,000 men took part, First Nations, Americans, British, and Canadians. How had this come about? The War of 1812 was slightly over 2 years old. During the early morning hours of July 3rd, 1814, a vast American invasion force under the command of Major General Jacob Brown had crossed the Niagara River from Black Rock near Buffalo. Fort Erie, with only a small detachment, surrendered that afternoon. The following day, July 4th, the Americans began to advance northward along the Niagara River, camping that night on the south side of Streets Creek, or Usher's Creek, as is now known, a short distance from us here. At the same time, the British, under Major General Phineas Ryle, marched south from Fort George to the north bank of Chippewa Creek at Chippewa, about where Kingsbridge Park is now. On the hot afternoon of July 5th, the two armies met here. The opening phase of this battle took place in the wooded area we can see just here to the west, and primarily involved the militia and native warriors on both sides. This was a deadly hit-and-run contest that resulted in heavy casualties. However, the major part, or second phase, if you like, of the Battle of Chippewa took place right here in these fields, or on the plain, as it was referred to at the time. So it was that in the late afternoon of that memorable July 5th, two formidable lines of infantry advanced toward each other at right angles to the Niagara River, the British having crossed the bridge over Chippewa Creek, and the Americans, led by Brigadier General Winfield Scott's 1st Brigade, having crossed Streets Creek from their camp on the opposite side. Both armies had artillery support, the British with 6 pieces, the Americans with 7. When the two lines were within 150 or 200 feet of each other, the firing began. It was around 5 o'clock. Ryle was at first deceived, thinking that because the Americans were wearing gray uniforms instead of regulation blue, he was facing poorly trained militia. He quickly realized his error. They were, in fact, well-trained, well-disciplined regulars. Canadian military historian and author Ernest Cruikshank, who was a native of Fort Erie and for a time during the first decade of the 20th century lived in Niagara Falls, wrote this about the battle here on the plain. As soon as the British approached within musketry range, they were assailed by a fierce and incessant fusillade from the American artillery. Losing heavily at every step, they moved steadily forward until within 200 feet of their adversaries, when they received the command to fire. The field here was intersected by deep furrows and covered with tall grass, which greatly impeded their movements and rendered their footing uncertain. Nearly every British field officer was struck down. The men fell in heaps under the scathing fire of the enemy. As they moved forward, the American artillery literally tore great gaps through their ranks, which for some time were steadily closed up. As another Canadian military historian, Donald Graves, has described the battle at this stage, in both lines, the dead and the wounded were dragged to the rear, and the remaining soldiers closed ranks. Blinded by smoke, crazed with thirst and fear, seeing comrades falling around them and hearing the screams of the wounded, the red-coated British and the gray-jacketed American infantry fired and loaded, fired and loaded. The incredibly brave Ryle was almost always out in front of his men, urging, encouraging, directing. By a miracle, he escaped unhurt, although his clothing was pierced by several bullets. After about 25 minutes of murderous fire between the two opposing lines, the flanks of the British line began to move back, and then the center began to waver. At that point, Ryle ordered a withdrawal, which was carried out in good order. The remaining British crossed the Chippewa Creek to their camp on the north side of the creek, and then tear up the bridge behind them. The Americans pursue the British to the south side of the creek, but are stopped there. The British on the far side are well entrenched and have very effective artillery. So at about 6:30, the Americans return to their camp. The battle is over. As night falls, the two armies are back where they were the night before, but with a significant difference. Some 700 men have been killed, wounded, or are missing in action. Of that number, about 200 lie dead on the battlefield and in the woods. Most of them were later buried here. William Hamilton Merritt, from what is now St. Catharines, commanded a force of provincial dragoons during the war. He arrived here later that evening after the battle was over. Merritt later wrote, "I came up in the evening after the action with a party of the troop. The men were obliged to lie out all night, every house being filled with the wounded. I stopped at Street's house and spent a very unpleasant night. Many officers were lying wounded, groaning with pain. Such was the result of the Battle of Chippewa." Yes, that was the human result, but of course the military result was the fact that it was an American victory. In fact, for the first time in the War of 1812, American infantry met and defeated British infantry of approximately equal numbers in open battle. An American colonel declared Chippewa was the most important action ever fought by American troops for giving an assurance of strength to our country, which she had never had any proof of before. And now, 199 years later, we are gathered here, as we should be, to honor those of all nations who fought here, and in particular honor those who spent the last hours of their life here and who sleep their eternal sleep in this ground.